The harbors were quiet in the summer of 1945. Row after row of grey hulls sat motionless in the water, their guns pointed toward nothing. These were the destroyer escorts, the small warships that had hunted submarines across 2 oceans, that had screened convoys through waters thick with mines and torpedoes. Now they simply waited, engines cold, decks empty except for the occasional maintenance crew moving silently through corridors that had once thundered with the sound of men running to battle stations. In Norfolk, in San Francisco, in Pearl Harbor, hundreds of these ships rode at anchor. The war had ended, but the vessels remained. What do you do with 500 warships when the shooting stops? The men who had sailed them were already gone. Within weeks of the Japanese surrender, the Navy began releasing sailors by the thousands. The point system determined who left first, those with the most service time, the most combat experience, the crews that had trained together, fought together, slept in shifts in cramped berthing spaces below the waterline. They scattered back to farms in Iowa, to factories in Detroit, to colleges on the GI Bill. The ships stayed behind. On the decks, equipment sat exactly as it had been left. Life jackets hung on their hooks. Coffee cups remained in the galley. Navigation charts were still pinned to tables in the chart rooms, but the hum of generators, the vibration of turbines, the constant movement of a vessel at sea, all of that had stopped. The silence in those first months was almost physical. The destroyer escorts had been built quickly, in shipyards that had never constructed warships before. Small yards in Texas, in California, on the Great Lakes. They were designed to be simple, cheap, and numerous. Between 1943 and 1945, American shipyards launched over 500 of them. Each one displaced about 1,500 tons. Each carried a crew of around 200 men. They were not glamorous ships. They were too small, too slow, too lightly armed to earn the headlines that went to battleships and aircraft carriers. But they had done the work. They escorted merchant convoys across the Atlantic, protecting supply lines against German U-boats. They screened invasion fleets in the Pacific, shooting down kamikaze aircraft, providing gunfire support for amphibious landings. 72 of them were sunk during the war. The rest survived. Now the Navy had to decide what to do with them. The immediate answer was mothballing. Starting in late 1945, destroyer escorts began moving to reserve fleets, clusters of anchored warships in quiet backwaters where maintenance could be minimized and the ships preserved against some uncertain future need. The process was methodical. Fuel tanks were drained and cleaned. Ammunition was offloaded. Equipment was coated in preservatives. Openings were sealed against weather and corrosion. The largest reserve fleet formed in Suisun Bay, north of San Francisco, in waters sheltered from the open ocean. Dozens of destroyer escorts were towed there and moored together in long lines, so close their hulls nearly touched. From the shore they looked like a floating city, a grey geometric pattern stretching across the water. But no one lived there. A skeleton crew visited periodically to check for leaks, to ensure the preservation was holding. But otherwise the ships sat untouched. Other fleets formed on the East Coast, in the estuaries of Virginia and the Carolinas. Some ships went to the Gulf Coast, others to the Pacific Northwest. By 1947, more than 300 destroyer escorts were in reserve, their future uncertain. The Navy's plan had been simple: preserve the ships until they were needed again. But the world was changing in ways no one had quite anticipated. In Washington, military planners were already looking past the war that had just ended and toward tensions that were beginning to emerge. The Soviet Union, an ally during the fight against Germany, was becoming something else. Borders in Europe were hardening. Ideological lines were being drawn. The phrase Iron Curtain entered common usage. In this new landscape, the destroyer escort seemed less relevant. The threats of the Second World War, the massed submarine campaigns, the need to protect slow merchant convoys across open ocean, those scenarios felt less likely. The new concern was atomic weapons, long-range bombers, political influence in regions far from American shores. The destroyer escort had been designed for a specific kind of war, and that war was over. So the ships continued to wait. Then in June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. American troops were committed within days. The Navy mobilized, and suddenly those mothball destroyer escorts had a purpose again. Over the next year, dozens of ships were pulled from the reserve fleets, towed to shipyards, reactivated. Crews were assembled, most of them young men who had been children during the Second World War, trained on equipment that was already beginning to feel outdated. The ships were sent to Korean waters, where they performed unglamorous but necessary work. Shore bombardment, patrol duty, screening larger vessels, but the reactivation was only partial. The Navy brought back perhaps 80 destroyer escorts, leaving the majority still in reserve, and even the reactivated ships were temporary measures. By 1954, with the Korean War over, most of them returned to the reserve fleets. The pattern was clear. The Navy would use the destroyer escorts when it needed numbers quickly, but it would not invest in keeping them modern. Meanwhile, other nations were looking at those rows of idle ships with interest. The 1950s saw a quiet but significant transfer program. Destroyer escorts that would have otherwise rusted away in American harbors were instead given, sold or loaned to Allied navies. Greece received several, so did Italy, France, Taiwan, South Korea, the Philippines. For these countries, many of them rebuilding from the devastation of the war or establishing new naval forces, the destroyer escorts represented modern capability at minimal cost. The ships were refitted before transfer, updated with newer radars and communications equipment, though the basic designs remained unchanged. They sailed under new names, flew new flags, but their silhouettes were unmistakable. An American destroyer escort from 1944 might serve in the Greek Navy until the 1970s, patrolling the Aegean, showing the flag in ports that had never seen it during the war. This was the hidden second life of the destroyer escort fleet. While the American ships sat dormant, their sisters continued active service in navies around the world. It was a form of foreign aid, a way to extend American influence without committing American personnel. And it was practical. The ships would have been scrapped otherwise. Back in the United States, the reserve fleets continued to shrink, but slowly, every few years, a decision would be made to decommission another group of vessels. They would be towed from their moorings to shipbreakers, cut apart for scrap metal. The process was industrial, efficient, without ceremony. A ship that had crossed the Atlantic dozens of times, that had survived depth charge attacks in storms and mechanical failures, would be reduced to raw steel in a matter of weeks. By 1960, fewer than 100 destroyer escorts remained in the American Reserve. By 1970, the number had dropped further. The Navy had moved on. New classes of ships, designed for anti-submarine warfare in the missile age, had entered service. They were larger, faster, equipped with sonar systems and weapons that made the old destroyer escorts seem primitive by comparison. But a handful of the old ships found an unexpected final role. In the early 1970s, the Coast Guard was looking for vessels to patrol waters far from shore, to enforce fisheries regulations, and conduct search and rescue operations. The destroyer escorts, with their long range and seaworthiness, fit the requirement. 26 of them were transferred to the Coast Guard, repainted white, stripped of most of their weapons, and put to work in a completely different mission than the one they had been designed for. These ships served into the 1980s, by which point they were among the oldest active vessels in American service. Their crews joked about the outdated equipment, the constant maintenance required to keep engines running that had been built 40 years earlier, but the ships kept working. They patrolled the Bering Sea, the Caribbean, the waters off Alaska, where weather and isolation made every voyage a test of endurance. The last Coast Guard destroyer escort was decommissioned in 1988. By then, the remaining vessels were museum pieces. A few were preserved, turned into memorials or training ships. The USS Slater, one of the few destroyer escorts still afloat, became a museum in Albany, New York, maintained by volunteers who understood that these ships represented something that should not be entirely forgotten. The rest were scrapped. The final groups went to shipbreakers in the 1990s and early 2000s, the last physical remnants of a fleet that had once numbered in the hundreds. By then, most of the men who had served on them were elderly or gone. The institutional memory had faded. The Navy had new priorities, new threats, new technologies. What remains is harder to quantify, The destroyer escorts were never the most famous warships of the Second World War. They did not earn the historical attention given to aircraft carriers or battleships. They were workhorses, unglamorous and numerous, designed to be built quickly and to perform a specific mission. They succeeded at that mission. They protected convoys, hunted submarines, supported invasions. 72 were lost. The rest came home, and then they were forgotten, slowly, in pieces. Some scrapped, some transferred, some left to rust in quiet harbors until the decision was finally made to let them go. The harbor at Suisun Bay, once crowded with grey hulls, is nearly empty now. The reserve fleets that stretched across American waters have been reduced to almost nothing. But in the early summer of 1945, before anyone knew what would come next, those ships sat in silent rows, engines cold, decks empty, waiting for a world that would not need them in the way they had been needed before. The silence then was the sound of a transition, the pause between one kind of history and another. The war had ended. The aftermath was just beginning. And in that long, quiet aftermath, the destroyer escorts simply faded away.